Welcome to Healing Voices with Pastor Dave Watson. Each day, this program will seek to provide insights and answers to the overwhelming issues our nation and city are facing. Pastor Dave and his guests will provide a Christian commentary on current events as well as scripturally sound solutions for the issues of the day. Pastor Dave has served as the senior pastor of Calvary Chapel on Staten Island for over 30 years. He's also the co-founder and president of the New York Institute for Biblical Studies. To download the podcast of this broadcast, find out more about Healing Voices, or support the program, please go to nycshepherd.com. That's nycshepherd.com. Now, here's Pastor Dave with today's broadcast.
Hello again. This is Pastor Dave Watson. Welcome to another edition of Healing Voices. Thank you so much for joining us. If you weren't with us yesterday, please get the podcast at WMCA Healing Voices. But today, we're going to talk again with Dr. Lawrence Taylor about the issue of the church and politics and how that plays out. What's exciting is that I'm able to bring back my guests. We talked for about 10 weeks about racism and racial issues, but these individuals that I've been interviewing, been talking with, they bring so much more to the table in terms of history and learning about the mistakes the church has made and the victories the church has won, that it's very helpful to us to continue our discussions. So Dr. Taylor is with us again today, and he's going to talk a little bit more about the church and politics. We left off yesterday with the Middle Ages, and believe it or not, there was life after the Middle Ages. After the pandemics of the Middle Ages, there was life. And we're going to talk about that life now with Dr. Taylor. Dr. Taylor, thank you again for being with us.
Glad to be with you.
So we left off really with the church and the state being combined, and the problems with that. And we want to pick things up now with the Reformation and the things following the Reformation around the 1300s to present. In terms of church and state, what happens?
Well, of course, as we talked about the last time, the church moved from being a countercultural movement to becoming incorporated into the state. And so by the time you get to the Reformation, the church, again, is the most powerful institution. So powerful that even emperors have to bow to the church. You know, I mean, there's a case of an emperor who did not, and this is in France, did not pay the Pope the proper homage that he should have. So he had to go to the Vatican, and he was in the snow, and he waited outside for several days before the Pope even let him in. That's how powerful the Pope was, okay? So this is pretty, now, by the time you get to the Reformation, again, the state is still the power, and the church doesn't have that kind of power, but it still owns land. It can persecute people who are not Catholic. And in fact, that's the story with the beginning of the Reformation, right? Because the person who started this movement was a Augustinian monk. He was a Catholic. And by challenging the church, he was actually endangering his life. Because, you know, the church could put you to death. The church had that kind of power.
And it had the help of the state in doing it.
Yes. But in the case of Martin Luther, it was the state that actually saved him.
Saved him.
Yeah. Luther was again a scholar. He was a doctor of theology, but he was also a Catholic a priest. And when he was given his commission to teach at the University of Wittenberg, the letters of Paul, he really discovered the doctrine of justification by faith, reading the book of Romans. my favorite book,
Favorite book.
and when he discovered this, he nailed his 95 Theses on the door of the church at Wittenberg. And by challenging the church because of its practices of indulgences, his life was in danger after that. And the princes hid him. A prince, actually, by the name of Frederick, hid him away so that the church would not get him, because he was actually called to a council of Worms, the Diet of Worms, okay? And there he refused to recant. And so he took on the power of the state by doing that. But since there was competition between the state and the church, some powerful princes invested in Luther, and that's how he survived. And that was the beginning of the Protestant Reformation.
That's where he said, "Here I stand, I can do nothing."
That's right. That is correct.
So here's something that has puzzled me. It seems like with the Protestant Reformation, there should have been an awakening of how the church and the state didn't do well mixing. But yet in Germany, for instance, Lutheranism becomes the state religion.
That's right.
In other parts of the empire or the world, the Reformed Church becomes Calvin, for instance, has a city-state. Zwingli has a city-state where the religion of the day rules those areas of the world. I mean, I think Calvin desperately wanted to make Geneva, a model of what the world should look like with the church in control. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think part of the reason why that was because the Reformation, and some scholars may disagree with this, but the Reformation was really a soteriological movement, a movement that emphasized salvation. There wasn't really any very clear teaching on ecclesiology because that was not its emphasis. There was no clear teaching on eschatology. Okay. Its major emphasis was to teach salvation and how a person gets right with God. So some of the same problems that we had prior to the movement continue after the movement. I think that probably is one of the contributing factors to how Calvin saw the state and the church, and Luther also, and some of the other reformers.
Would it be true? And I don't want to scare off our listeners with big words, but it seems to me that both the church state issue, which really came up about before the Middle Ages and extended through the Middle Ages, and then the church state issue that came about even after the Reformation, was a belief that the church's job was to bring in the kingdom on earth. Is that a lot of the thinking that goes behind it, that comes from the concept of the city of God with Augustine?
Augustine, yes, I believe so. And I think some of that becomes even more developed as the Reformation continues in Europe, that they were going to bring about the kingdom of God on the earth. Yeah.
That was their job.
That was their job. Yeah.
So therefore, it was okay for the religious leaders and the to become, actually in some cases, the religious leaders become the state leaders.
Yeah, that's right, and it is certainly true with Calvin, right?
Yes. And so right after the Reformation, you do have the phenomenon of England, and England being a situation where the church and the state combine, correct?
Yeah, because you have a Reformation that takes place in England too, but the grounds for that Reformation is different than Germany or Switzerland. The grounds for that Reformation was Henry the eighth was offended because the church didn't grant him the divorce that he wanted, so he just pulled the whole nation out of the church. And there you have that Protestant Reformation with the Anglican Church. But the Anglican Church is really a Catholic church also. And it's just that it's not under Rome.
Not under Rome. And at the same time, we do have, again, Christians being persecuted. I think of the Anabaptists who fled and said, I don't want church and state. We have the Pilgrims who fled, not wanting church and state.
Well, of course, you have the Puritans also
Yes.
in England. Now, their attempt was, well, their name tells you, to purify the church. They wanted to get rid of all the Catholic stuff and wanted a real Protestant church. And so they're persecuted also. And of course, let's not mention the fights that go on between the Catholics and the Anglicans. That was just ongoing and ongoing.
And very bloody.
Yeah, very bloody. That's right.
Hence Bloody Mary, etc.
Yeah, that's right. So
take us a little bit forward then to the 1700s. Does the church do good with reference to things like slavery?
Yeah. So when we look at the role of the church in slavery, I think people often generalize and say, well, Christianity promoted slavery, and that's true. But I think there are two points that we should look at. Number one, the abolitionist movement was also primarily a Christian movement. And so while the church did promote slavery, you also had Christians who were vehemently against slavery, who spoke out against slavery. And what motivated them was their commitment to Christ. So the abolitionist movement is I think primarily a Christian movement also.
And we see that in England through Wilberforce and the Chatham Society. Society. In the United States, where is that movement found? What is it found in a denomination, or is it found in Christendom in general?
Well, of course, you have denominations divided over the issue of slavery, right? Yeah. I mean, you have the Great Awakenings. A lot of people may not be aware of this. There was an attempt to convert slaves to Christianity. The dominant churches, of course, Congregational Church, the Church of England, and the slaves were not really converting at large numbers. They weren't that interested. That changed by the 1750s with the Great Awakening in the colonies. And so a number of slaves began to convert to Christianity because this was the religious expression in this movement was something that appealed to them. But also the Second Great Awakening, the same thing was true, which was around the 1840s or so. But many of the leaders in these movements were opposed to slavery. So John and Charles Wesley opposed to slavery. Charles Finney in the Second Great Awakening was opposed to slavery. Albert Barnes, I don't know if you're familiar with Barnes' Notes.
Barnes Commentary, who doesn't have that?
Yeah, right. Barnes was opposed to slavery. We see that a number of Christians spoke out against slavery. But unfortunately, there were just too many who did believe that slavery was ordained by God. I think what's interesting is Lincoln Abraham Lincoln talks about a book that he read by a minister who justified slavery on the grounds of religion. And Lincoln was fascinated with this, and of course he opposed the whole idea, so we got a mixed bag here, but it was certainly Christianity that helped to give some of the zeal to these anti-slavery movements.
Well, when we get to the 1900s, I mean, I know a little bit more about this era. We do seem to have, at least in America, a strong separation of church and state, and a desire to keep it that way. It's amazing. Some of when you read some of the writings, like of a man like J. Frank Norris, who was the fundamentalist of fundamentalists, who is famous for in the late 1920s having a radio broadcast going coast to coast and preaching messages against the government. One of his famous ones was, "Will Uncle Sam be made an ass again?" Interesting message. So we see a separation of church and state, but we still have major issues that we're trying to deal with here in this country regarding civil rights, regarding the suffrage movement, women voting. Does the church play a role in those?
Yeah, well, it's know that the suffrage movement, because you have the Seneca Falls Conference of 1848, led by many folks who were church leaders. And part of that movement was because women wanted to have the right to speak out against slavery. They weren't allowed to speak out, so they came together and said, look, we have a right also to voice our opinions against slavery. I think that was one of the factors behind the Seneca Falls Conference. But if you go back to the 1900s, go back to the 20th century, you don't see Christians advocating for a lot of involvement in the state, in politics. But you do have the civil rights movement, and in the civil rights movement in the late 1950s or mid 1950s, eventually becomes led by the religious leaders. Now, the movement did not start off that way. I think that's a misnomer. King was the leader of this movement. That is not true. Okay, this movement began with organizations like the NAACP, like the Women's Council or Caucus. It began with local leaders like people like E.D. Nixon and so names that people may not be familiar with.
So the church was late to the dance, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Now, the religious leaders do take it over. And the reason why is because they have not only the gravitas, but they don't have to worry about the same kind of reprisals that other leaders had to worry about, especially those who worked for government. They could lose their jobs. The pastors depended on the people for their living. People met, especially, we're talking about the Southern civil rights movement. People met in the churches. So they had the largest audience. And so that's why the church leaders actually take over the movement. They're at the vanguard of the movement. So in many respects, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was a religious movement because church leaders are at the forefront. They're at the vanguard of this movement.
And that's, of course, there's a political end of that the church is involved in.
Yeah, yes. I mean, fighting for the right to vote, I guess, would be, you can say certainly is political. And it's also a human right, too, a right of them that every American citizen should have. The right for blacks to vote was given to blacks back in with the 15th Amendment to the Constitution back in 1872 or so. But the right was still denied. That right was denied. So blacks fought for that right. And unfortunately, these religious leaders did lead the movement. It was people like Martin Luther King, but not just King, but he was one of them, because Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, and a whole bunch of others who helped lead this movement. And again, they didn't have to face the same kind of reprisals that others had to face.
Now, on the other side of maybe the political spectrum, even the white evangelical church was relatively silent during the civil rights movement. Of course, I don't think it was known as the white evangelical movement then. It really is. It isn't until around 1980 that we see a rise of a white evangelical coalition in support of Ronald Reagan, primarily because 7 years later, or 7 years earlier, the Supreme Court had said that abortion was the law of the land. What happens in that time frame?
Well, we're talking about really 1979 with the creation of the moral majority, and there were basically four men who founded that movement. Of course, Jerry Falwell was one. Pat Robinson was another. We have
Tim LaHaye and
Tim LaHaye and Weinrich. Paul Weinrich.
I think D. James Kennedy played a role in that too, as I'm recalling. But yeah. I'm old. That's the problem, Larry. I can't remember everybody.
Yes. So it's now the idea was to get Ronald Reagan elected, right? Because there was no evidence, by the way, no evidence whatsoever that Ronald Reagan was a born again Christian.
An evangelical.
The guy in the White House was guy in the White House was a born again Christian. He said he was, right? Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter was very clear about being born again.
Right. He's a born again Christian, but he was much too liberal for their blood. So in fact, somebody did ask Ronald Reagan, was he born again? He said, I guess so. So this was really a political movement, no question about it.
And from that time, even until today, there is a block known as the evangelical vote, right?
Yeah, that's right. That is right. And it's been consistent, and they've been basically together on a lot of things. I mean, even the last presidential election, more than 82% of evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. And now let me qualify that, and let's make sure we're talking about primarily white evangelicals. Because in many respects, the black church has been evangelical too, evangelical in terms of their understanding of Scripture. They believe that the Bible is the Word of God, inerrant, infallible. But the black church did not vote in large numbers for the Republican candidate. They voted for the Democratic candidate.
This is incredibly interesting. Sociologically and biblically, this discussion we've had. This is Pastor Dave Watson. The time has flown. This has been another edition of Healing Voices. My guest has been Dr. Lawrence Taylor, and we have learned a lot today about both the fact that the church has been involved with the state and in politics, and perhaps a little bit about the dangers in all that. Please join us again next time for another edition of Healing Voices. Thank you for joining us. God bless you.
Thanks for listening to today's broadcast. To download the podcast of this broadcast, find out more about Healing Voices, or support the program, please go to nycshepherd.com. That's nycshepherd.com. To get a free CD of the broadcast, please call 718-720-5394. That's 718-720-5394. Healing Voices is an extension of the ministry of Pastor Dave Watson, Calvary Chapel, and God in Our City. Please join us every weekday at this time for another edition of Healing Voices with Pastor Dave Watson. Until next time, may our God richly bless you as you serve Him.